Welcome to Raise the Line with Osmosis from Elsevier, seeking solutions with leading experts on how to increase healthcare capacity so people can get the care they need during the pandemic and beyond.
Hi everybody, I'm Michael Carisse, and today on Raise the Line, we're going to focus our attention on the fascinating intersection of innovation in life sciences and oncology. As our guides, I'm delighted to welcome two guests. Marc Cummings is president and CEO of Life Science Washington. That's a nonprofit trade association serving the life sciences industry in the state of Washington. And also with us is Dr. Tina Albertson. She's the chief medical officer and head of development at Lyell Immunopharma. That's a biotech company focused on delivering better therapeutic options for patients with solid tumors. And thanks to you both very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we always start on the show getting some professional background. We have an audience of med students and early career professionals. They're always curious to find out how people ended up where they do. So Marc, why don't we start with you? What first got you interested in the tech space and then life sciences?
Yeah, so I've spent my whole life sort of in technology, not necessarily just life sciences. Spent the first half of my career in Washington, D.C., working in the software and then also in clean tech industries. Then spent the last half of my career here in Washington State, advocating on behalf of the industry and focused specifically on life sciences. But always sort of that nexus between innovation, policy, and industry.
And what about you, Dr. Albertson? What drew you to medicine and particularly pediatric oncology?
Yeah, no, thank you. I started my academic career in molecular biology and really got interested in, what goes wrong in a cell to become a cancer cell. So my first interest in cancer became through the biology route. And as I went through my undergraduate education, decided medicine would be a good fit for me and went on to medical school. And as I explored the different medical fields, oncology continued to be of interest for me, both from the scientific standpoint, but in particular for pediatric oncology, the personal side of it, the family unit that you got to interact with and help support. And as I went through my career and training, I ended up back in Washington at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center, where both the science side of it and the medicine side of it were front and center. And I really learned that I enjoyed both aspects of that. I actually, after my training in clinical oncology, went back and got my PhD in cancer biology as well. And as I started my academic career and my clinical career, realized that I could actually benefit more patients through industry and the development of drugs for large populations of patients rather than the individual contribution of helping a patient in the clinic one-on-one. And so for me, it was a great intersection between the science and the medicine, leaving academic clinical medicine and going into industry where a whole team of people are working towards getting drugs tested and approved with the FDA so that hundreds and thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of patients can benefit from those trials and new drugs.
Yeah, that's a different dimension of impact for sure. Marc, why don't you tell us a little bit about Washington's life science industry for those who might not be familiar with it? You have quite a reputation out there for that.
Yeah, so Washington State has a long history in life sciences going back really to the 70s. We've always had a real strong med school in University of Washington. In those early years, a lot of the spinouts had been in the medical device space. So we had leaders in ultrasound, in defibrillators. There's actually a time when I think 60 Minutes did a show and referred to Seattle as the best place in America to have a heart attack because we had just taken the defibrillators and put them into ambulances for the first time. So they were portable, right? Fast forward, 30, 40 years, and we've really become this biotech hub that, for many years had a real strong background on the research side. But in the recent decade or so, we've really added the commercialization component of that. New companies like Lyell and others that have grown dramatically. And all that is built on a really strong research base. I think one of the things that's unique about the ecosystem here is a real strong mix of nonprofit research institutes. So, Fred Hutch Cancer Center, Gates Foundation, Allen Institute, Fred Hutch, Benaroya Research Institute, and others that really provide this mix of of both incredible research that has both global reach and then also really, the underpinning for the research that is gone into the companies here. I'm sure Tina will talk a little bit about that, particularly in the oncology space. And then, I think, one of the things that's interesting here is that we are sort of this sort of kind of really kind of advanced in an innovation cluster. So we tend to go after really hard problems here, which is why you saw, for example, the first FDA approved drug in the world for immunotherapy was developed here in Seattle in 2010, which served as much of the foundation again for many of the things I think that Tina will talk about. So with that, let me maybe turn over to Tina to talk a little bit sort of about the immunotherapy space.
Yeah, and how Lyle fits into that picture that Marc just painted.
Yeah, and it really starts with our University of Washington and Fred Hutch institutions that really form the base of both the science and medicine that underpin immunotherapy. As Marc mentioned, Provenge was one of the first cellular therapies on the market. But the Fred Hutch has been working, they were pioneers in bone marrow transplant, which is really kind of the primary first cell therapy that went into patients. And folks there have been working on genetically engineered and non-genetically engineered cell therapies for decades. And a couple companies have come out directly from the Fred Hutch, and not just in cell therapy, but in a lot of innovative cancer and other industries as well. And so it really comes from an institution and a city that's really well prepared for innovation, not just from a science standpoint and the basic science coming out of those institutions, but also, and I think we'll talk about this later, the technology of Seattle and the tech side of our community as well. And so what first came out of the Hutch was Juno Therapeutics, which was then bought by Celgene and BMS, and they were one of the first three companies to make CAR T cells, which is a genetically engineered cell therapy for B-cell malignancies. This is thing like leukemia, lymphoma, but they couldn't get it to work in solid tumors. So solid tumors tend to have a few more immunosuppressive elements that make it so these therapeutics don't work as well. And so Lyle was founded to try to overcome some of those barriers in solid tumor microenvironment that turn these immune cells off. And so we're committed to making cell therapy work to make those cells resistant to what we call T cell exhaustion and resistant to these mechanisms that shut down the immune system in solid tumor patients, to try to get the same benefit for solid tumor patients that we've seen from immunotherapy and cell therapy in hematologic malignancies.
And how is it going?
We're in the clinic. Well, our science is strong. As I mentioned, we have founders from the Hutch, but we also have founders from the NIH and from Stanford University. So we have amazing science, and we're putting it in the clinic. And ask me in a year or two, and we'll be able to tell you. But our mission is to make things better for these patients, and we're all hoping we can do that.
So you both mentioned the sort of tech hub side of the Washington story. Marc, maybe you can get a little more specific for us about how that impacts the life sciences industry and pick up on some of what Tina was talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has obviously been a trend that, over the past 4, 5, 8 years has been a big deal in terms of sort of the convergence of sort of biotech and traditional technology, big data, that kind of thing. And obviously here, home of Microsoft, home of Amazon, and literally hundreds of other, tech companies that either spun off or are part of that ecosystem, really makes this state in this region, a leader globally in terms of having that skill set when it comes to big data and cloud computing. And it's kind of interesting because, we had this conversation 5, 6 years ago and everybody saw this coming. But when you said, okay, what are the projects happening? There are only a handful. Fast forward to today, and we've got, a wide range of companies that, are either founded on or their technology is driven by, either AI, machine learning, or access to big cloud data sets and that kind of thing. And they range the gamut from a blood testing company that uses AI enhanced tools to give you a better outcome to a company like Adaptive Biotechnology that is effectively partnered with Microsoft to basically map the human immune system and then using that to develop both new therapeutics as well as diagnostics. So it's really an exciting time. here to have those two areas coming together. And we'll see, I think, also on the digital health side, we've certainly seen during the pandemic, the rise of sort of telehealth. So there's a whole category of companies there as well that we see emerging that are taking advantage of that. I'll let Tina maybe talk a bit more kind of in the immunotherapy space, how they're utilizing those tools.
Over to you, Tina.
Yes. I think there's two aspects of the technology sector that have helped, particularly cell therapy, but I think drug development in general in Seattle. And the first is big data. And Marc mentioned that, computing power. And it started, with the large data sets, for sequencing the genome, as he mentioned. But when you think about a cell and you're making a genetically engineered cell product for every patient you treat, each product's different, and each product has hundreds of different characteristics that we track and we keep track of and try to figure out which aspects of those cells matter and don't matter. And so we have data sets that are enormous compared to a small molecule in a vial off the shelf, right? And so what we have found is just from data management, data analysis, we need the power of this technology to just analyze our data and deconvolute what matters for cell therapy and immunotherapy for the patient. Additionally, cellular therapies are logistically complicated. You take the cells from the patient at the site of care, you send them on a plane, a commercial flight to, in our case, Seattle. You have to do that within a very short period of time so that you can start processing the cells, genetically engineer them, culture them, expand them, freeze them back down, and send them back to the patient for when they're ready to be treated. All of that takes logistics power. We have, we track flights, we track weather, we track, things that can go wrong in getting the cells to and from a patient. Not only that, but as the cells are growing, if a machine isn't working right, we don't want that product to be ruined by an electrical shutdown or a malfunction of a machine. And so we use the power of technology to track and monitor, but also the logistics. We have Amazon Web Services, both for data, but also for their logistics expertise. How can we scale this kind of medical therapy where it's requiring, different steps that aren't simply medical? They're, as I mentioned, flights and other types of technology that are needed. And so we're partnering with those kind of companies to make these things seamless. How can we make it easier for the patient and for the clinic to do these things?
Yeah, now that is something we've done 350 shows and nobody has ever talked about that aspect of it. I mean, there's always more to it once you start getting deeper into it, and more opportunities, I think, for different sorts of jobs that people don't even know exist, which, Marc, turning to you, I mean, talk about the workforce piece of this. Two things. One, what are some of the newer positions, occupations, professions, whatever, that are emerging from all of this that you're talking about? And secondly, I would think you guys have a real deep bench there. You got a pool of people from which to draw because of all of the educational institutions and Microsoft and everything else you're talking about.
Yeah, no, it's interesting times. And I think, what's interesting about life sciences is the data and computing power certainly allows you to ground truth more questions and be able to kind of narrow the funnel. But at the end of the day, you still have to have science behind that. Right. So it can lead you sort of to answers and insights. But at the end of the day, you still need to understand what the mechanism is that's driving, the change that you're looking for. And so it's bringing us together. And so we see that with many of our companies where, the number of data scientists on staff has grown dramatically. In some companies, as many as probably half the company, which you wouldn't think of. I always say a lot of folks think, oh, well, I can't work in the industry unless, I'm an old gray haired with a lab coat. And the reality is that, the makeup of the companies has changed dramatically in the last few years to, as you said, both adding data science, but then also as the companies grow, and evolve from research companies into manufacturing, right? You have skill sets that range from folks that are coming straight out of high school, work in manufacturing operations, through folks working in, entry-level science, through folks that are, PhDs and postdocs with degrees and backgrounds like Tina's. So there's a real diversity of jobs available. And then I think, the challenge there is, again, we see, particularly on the data science side, you need that core understanding and skill set, but you've got to be able to then apply that, right, in a different environment than, let's say, gaming or other software development. We always say, like, I have yet to find anybody that wants to sign up for that first beta test of a heart transplant, right?
Right.
And so, the mentality within the industry is a bit different. So it's the same skill sets, but applying them in an environment of, much longer research cycles, regulated environment where, you just simply can't make mistakes with human lives. But also at the same time, we see a lot of folks that have maybe grown up in traditional tech, and they've been in a couple of companies, and they really love the idea of going and working in a company that really impacts patients' lives, as opposed to just developing code and games and that kind of thing. And so, depends on what your background is, but you need sort of a mix of skill sets. We're seeing more and more folks, want to jump in, particularly on the kind of the digital health side. And it's competition, right? Because it's like, if you're an early stage clinical company or an early stage company, it's tough to pay the same amount as an Amazon or a Microsoft for those in-demand software engineers. But most of the folks that make the switch really enjoy the challenge and the output of that work and the impact it has on patients.
One of the favorite parts of this show for us is getting advice from the guests. Again, as a reminder, a lot of our audience are med students, other health profession students, early career professionals. So let me ask you each in turn, starting with you, Dr. Albertson. What advice would you give to someone, maybe an earlier version of yourself, if that's an easier way to think about it, in an educational program looking to their career in life sciences and biotech and cancer innovation research? What would you tell them?
I think for someone just starting out in medicine or science that's interested in helping patients, and particularly oncology, which is my obviously interest, I think you need to be open-minded and curious about what's out there. When you start in your education, mostly what you're focusing on and what you're exposed to is academics, but that's not the only career path. We need practicing physicians, we need basic scientists, and those people are involved in things like what I do. However, there's also people with PhDs and MDs that are on the business side of biotech. They're like me, where they are running clinical trials and managing groups of people who are getting drugs tested and approved with the FDA. Those each are different jobs that, if you have the science background or the medical background, could be of interest to them. And so my main recommendation is to explore some of these different paths that may be better suited or just may be different for different times of your life. Clinical practice is great for some people. It may not be a perfect fit for all. And academics is the same way. It takes a specific kind of person to love the academic world. And some people are better suited for a more industry-based career. And there's a lot out there if you look.
Well, yeah, it is one of the nice things about being in the health professions is the incredible variety of places you can find yourself. So, Marc Cummings, how would you answer that question about advice to younger version of yourself?
Yeah, well, I would echo what Tina said. I mean, I think the real key is sort of being curious in those early years. I think, I think about it when so many students, go to college or university and they're probably in freshman biology thinking that, they're pre-med, but only a fraction of folks end up, going on to get their doctorate, right? And so there's so many alternate career paths that I think students aren't aware of, that are open to them. And so that's one of the things is, in those early years, reach out, talk to folks that are working in sort of, non-traditional, that it's not just a nurse or a doctor, but someone that is working in the industry, that is running a trial, that is, working in some of those fields. And it's, as Tina said, I mean, it's not just the academic and the research component. I mean, there's certainly that, which is available to everybody, but there's the entire business side, right? I mean, there's, any good biotech, you've got to raise money, you've got regulatory affairs, you've got manufacturing operations. So there's a real diversity of jobs that are available to folks. I think folks don't always think about that initially when they think about going into healthcare, is the diversity of jobs that are available. And so, reach out, explore. We're doing a lot of that work with some of our colleges in the state here, trying to add sort of a survey course so they get exposure to those different fields, and then can go out, not necessarily take a job, but do a summer internship or just get some lab experience. So again, you can kind of you see what's available beyond sort of academic training, at a R01 kind of university.
Great advice. And another favorite question of ours in the last minute or two we have here. We are a teaching company, as folks may know. We love to fill knowledge gaps. And I want to ask you if there's a topic of particular interest to you. Could be what we've been talking about, could be something completely different where there's a real gap or a myth or whatever that you would say to Osmosis, you guys should make a video about that. What would that be, Dr. Albertson?
For me, I think there's a huge educational gap in the understanding of what a clinical trial is, both from what it takes to get a drug from the very first patient ever treated to approval, but also what it means for a patient. What does it actually entail? What kind of benefit can the patient have? Can the field have in the data and learnings from that patient and from that trial? Like, why are clinical trials important? One of the reasons I went into pediatric oncology is almost every child with cancer goes on a clinical trial. And the advances that came from that rigor is amazing. Over 90% of kids are cured of cancer. And that's not true with adults. Adults don't go on trials. And part of it is fear. They don't understand what they're signing up for and what the value is to the world, to the medical community, by offering up their ability to participate in a trial. So that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, that's a great topic. What about you, Mark?
I think for me, and this maybe, because I spent a lot of my time sort of in the public policy space, is just helping educate people on the time and cost and effort that it takes to bring a new therapy, to market, to a place where it actually can have an impact on patient. I think, right now, we always hear folks that they want to lower costs and they want to access this, a $25 copay. You can't get a cancer therapy for a $25 copay at the, corner drugstore, right? I mean, particularly in this market here, our companies are working on, just like Tina, I mean, some of the absolutely most advanced therapeutics in the world. And those usually take 5 to 10 years of work in the academic environment before you spend another, 2 to 5 years, on a partnering path to, going to then moving into the clinic and moving through trials. And so, in many cases, I mean, that's a 10 or 15 year journey, in the case when you've got really great science that's been proven to begin with. And so when I talk to folks, there's this knee-jerk reaction to sort of, we want things to be cheaper. And the reality is, once you walk people through sort of what that process looks like, it's not like tech where you get a few folks in a garage, write some code and you've got a product out in 18 months or 24 months, right?
24 hours. If it's an app.
24 hours, right? We've got folks that spend 10 years on the research side before you even move it into product development. And once you sort of internalize and think about that timeline and process, the different institutions involved and the different collaborations it takes to do that, people begin to have an appreciation of how much time, effort, and cost it takes to really bring a breakthrough therapy like a new cancer therapy for solid tumors to market. And then their perspective is a little bit different then on sort of
Right. Well, that's a great perspective. And really appreciate you sharing all this wisdom with us. We've been talking to Marc Cummings, President and CEO of Life Science Washington, and Dr. Tina Albertson, Chief Medical Officer and Head of Development at Lyell Immunopharma. Thank you both so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm Michael Carisse, and we want to thank you for checking out today's show. Remember to do your part to raise the line and strengthen the healthcare system. We're all in this together.
If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes at osmosis.org/raisethelines podcast.